insisting that you had to conduct clinical trials and that these clinical trials had to show both safety and efficacy requirements. So some commentators have actually said that the insistence on clinical trials evidence may actually have led to a withdrawal of product that if you kind of would have looked at more long-term and more complex evidence that some of these products actually may have been better than was thought in 1965. But can't discuss this in detail here, but since 1962, 1965 and the decades following, you clearly see worldwide the development of increasingly detailed drug regulatory requirements, but always or largely based on a review of clinical trials data that had to be submitted by drug regulatory companies, by pharmaceutical companies to the regulator. And these data were reviewed by the drug regulator and led to a rejection or an approval of a pharmaceutical product. They focused, all of these regulatory requirements focused largely on market entry. And it's an important point that you have to keep in mind, because it means that once the drugs were on the market, regulatory control basically largely stopped. I'm overemphasizing it here. In the last couple of years, we certainly have a growing emphasis on the need for market for drug regulatory control once pharmaceutical products are in the market. But it's fair to say that even now today, the emphasis is largely on market entry. You submit your clinical trials data, you get your product on the market, and then the product can be sold in a context in which a lot of liberty allows actually for potential abuse. You have, for example, the possibility of promoting indirectly off-label prescription, and so on and so on. So I'll give you some examples of that, but again, I have to be reasonably brief to come to the discussion about transparency as a regulatory means to change a little bit this particular paradigm. So what was the result of the growing regulatory system, the growing regulatory requirements in the period post-thalidomide up to now? So the system that we've developed is characterized, and if you have questions about that, I can say something more about that in detail, but I have to summarize basically what I see as the characteristics of the drug regulatory system now. It's a system with an extraordinary reliance on data produced and submitted by industry, primarily at market entry. Yes, there is regulatory review in some countries in more detail than others, but again, it's primarily the pharmaceutical companies that have to produce the clinical trials data. It's also a system that led, interestingly, to a whole new industry, an industry that works directly for the pharmaceutical companies, and that is focusing on the production of data, which is an interesting phenomenon if you think about it. So it's an industry that purely developed as a result of drug regulatory requirements. It's now estimated as a $5 billion industry, where you have contract research organizations focusing on running clinical trials. You have commercial research ethics committees who actually review clinical trials as part of the drug regulatory system, working for pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations. You have communications agencies who work for the pharmaceutical companies, who with the CROs basically work on the production of analysis of clinical trials data and publications in the scientific literature. And you have increasingly an integration of academic science, investigators, and academic literature as well, in an industry-controlled production of science. So what is also a complicated story is, for example, that certainly since the 80s, clinical trials have significantly moved out of academia. So before, it used to be the case that academic investigators were more involved in conducting the clinical trials. There was not such a direct relation between data production companies and industry, and you had more academics involved in some way in the production of clinical trials data and analysis of the results. But the clinical trials, the conduct of clinical trials itself has actually significantly shifted. So a large majority of trials, up to 80–90% of clinical trials, are now conducted outside of academic centers and academic investigators are now actually more and more simply functioning as scientists who give credibility to studies that have been conducted elsewhere. So I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but sometimes you have to put things starkly as they are, a little bit starker than they are, and we will, I'll show you actually some problems. So what are the problems that result from this particular change in the paradigm of the conduct of clinical trials and the conduct of the creation of scientific evidence? You have a control of the industry over the production, the distribution, and the use of data. The use of data, I mean thereby drug prescription practices. So industry produces the data, analyzes the results, works with specialized communications agency to get the articles published, also in the scientific literature. Scientific literature is thus shaped by the people who have actually an interest in selling the drugs. And they influence, for example, clinical practice guidelines, which inform physicians about how to prescribe pharmaceutical products. There are various problems with that. So again, I can't discuss all of the evidence that exists there, but in the scientific literature, in the medical literature, many meta-analyses are published about the relation, for example, between funders of research and outcome of research, about clinical trial design influenced by the financial interest at stake, and so on. So to summarize it, well, we see problems with skewed clinical trial design. We see an incredible amount of evidence about the hiding and misrepresentation of clinical trials data, which we have to call what it is. It's basically fraudulent misrepresentation in many cases, certainly not just bias in the context of research. We see manipulation of scientific literature in practices of off-label prescription, and we see an aggressive promotion of off-label prescription, which often straddles legality, and which actually has led to quite a lot of prosecutions in the United States. And I would say you have limited control of the regulatory agencies. So some people may challenge me on that, but I actually think overall it's surprising that certainly with respect to the scientific production and the manipulation of science, the drug regulatory agencies are actually not doing so much. So the products are approved on the basis of relatively limited evidence, with, I would say, little control on the distribution of knowledge and drug safety after approval. And I'll give you some examples now. These are just snapshots. You can say I selected them. Obviously I selected them, but there is actually, I have a tendency to enter into these stories with too many examples. So if I will be running out of time, it's because there are too many examples actually which are quite interesting. A little bit rhetoric is to refer here to what the industry itself says about the nature of scientific evidence. This is a manual which I found many years ago, probably already 10 years ago, called Scientific Publication Strategy, Managing Reputation, Clinical Trial Results, and Commercial Relevance, Best Practices LLP. So I found it on the internet. I didn't buy it. It was a little bit too expensive for my purse, $3,695. I don't think CIHR or SHRC would have found it reasonable for me to buy this manual. So it's a manual of the scientific publications industry working for the pharmaceutical companies. What do they say about scientific data? Well, they say picking and choosing favorable findings may have been acceptable a decade ago. I never thought it was acceptable, but you see that basically in the industry there is, on the internet, you easily find a quote like this saying, well, you know, we did this. We were involved in picking favorable findings, but it's now considered unethical and potentially illegal. But then also scientific publications are an essential tool for both clinical and commercial purposes. They are intended to influence the target audience. So you see here already basically a blunt statement in the publication industry about science is a commercial product. Which in and of itself not bad, but obviously if you kind of connect it to the first, it's a problem. Now, what kind of practices have been exposed in the literature? I already mentioned there's a vast amount of evidence available, both in the literature, in books, in manuscripts that actually detail in quite some detail problems with the pharmaceutical industry and the interactions between pharmaceutical industry and the physicians. I just put some titles here of influential books by former editors of the New England Journal of Medicine. So these are not just sensationalist writers. These are people who work in the medical profession, who actually have been troubled by what has been going on and how it actually shapes and influences medical practice. So there's quite a lot of evidence that they discuss in these books. You can read some of these. There's a vast literature, which is, I would say, actually a hopeful sign about how the profession is looking at this and trying to change the way we deal with scientific evidence. So you see in the medical literature a large number of studies actually that highlight some of the things that are documented also in these books. So let me give you simply some examples that give you a sense of how systemic the problem really is. So one interesting example is this one. So this is a publication by Turner and others in the New England Journal of Medicine, where this research group actually looked at the data submitted to the Food and Drug Administration with respect to the new antidepressants that were submitted in a particular period of time to the Food and Drug Administration. So they found 74 FDA registered studies. When they looked at the data that the FDA received, they came to the conclusion that of these studies, only 51 were positive. So in other words, you have a large number of antidepressants approved with at least, good to know that it's questionable data, 51 positive, 41 negative, meaning they raised safety or efficacy issues. But what's more problematic is when they looked at the published literature, they came to the conclusion that 94% of the literature was positive about the studies supporting the new antidepressants. And what's troubling of that is that 22 studies were not published, but even more troubling that 11 studies, which they found in the 74 FDA registered studies, that 11 were negative but were published conveying a positive outcome. So you see here concrete evidence. The FDA receives certain data. The published literature says a completely different story. What do the physicians read? They don't go to the FDA files. Even these researchers had difficulty getting a good grasp of what the studies were saying. But you see here that what we rely on in medical practice, or what physicians rely on in medical practice, is misrepresenting what the drug regulatory agency itself has. So if I talk about limited control, I would say, how is that possible? How is it possible that we have a drug regulatory system, that we have scientific publications influencing prescription practices, but that the drug regulator doesn't go out there and say, well, there is actually a problem here with the scientific literature. There is misrepresentation. There's serious problems with the information that doctors and the public receive. There are many other examples. There's so again, it shows you that the medical profession or medical researchers are at least interested and even have some humor in the way they design studies. So this is another story. I won't discuss it in detail, but the title says it in and of itself. So published in the influential journal, the American Journal of Psychiatry, these researchers looked at 30 reports of comparative efficacy of clinical trials funded by industry on antipsychotics, and they came to the conclusion, if you look at all of these studies, every drug beats the other drug. So olanzapine beats risperidone, risperidone beats quetiapine, and quetiapine beats olanzapine. So showing simply that depending on who funds the study, you get an interesting outcome. I'll give you a last example before I move to some of the discussions about regulation and transparency, because it's an example that I will come back to when we deal with the issue of transparency, what transparency can do. Here you have an example of a study that was undertaken in on the efficacy of Seroxat Paxil for the treatment of depression in children and adolescents. Now, the important thing you have to know, this was a drug that was already on the market. It was approved for the treatment of depression in adults. And the company producing the drug was actually interested in running clinical trials to be able to obtain a label change. In other words, to be able to have the drug approved for the treatment of depression in children and adolescents, because it then allows also in the United States at least to actually more aggressively market the drug, to do direct consumer advertising, which is not, at least in theory, not allowed in the Canadian context. And so what did they do? They conducted a couple of clinical trials, and here you see a confidential document that became available actually as a result of lawsuits in the United States, in which the researchers themselves, and basically the company has these documents, come to the conclusion that the data of these studies are insufficiently robust to support a label change. In other words, the data is not interesting. The clinical trial study 329 raised actually safety and efficacy issues. So there were concerns actually that it had a negative impact on the health and well-being of individual patients, children and adolescents. You have to know that this drug was already widely prescribed off-label. So it's not that physicians couldn't prescribe it. They were actually prescribing it off-label already at a very significant rate, which was perfectly legal. So you and I will certainly agree that if you think about public health related concerns, that it's completely unacceptable to conduct clinical trials, to find that there are problems with the safety and efficacy of the studies, and then to basically hide the data. Decide, as a company, we will not publicize these data, knowing very well that people will continue to prescribe the drugs off-label.
Disconnection.
So, I don't see my screen anymore.
There you go.
Yeah, but I don't see anything in it anyway. Can you put it back that I see mine?
Yep.
Okay. So what's even more problematic is if you look at the data, if you look at the study, so the company decides that they won't ask for a label change because the drug regulatory agencies will reject it. But what they decided is they started to publish studies with the who of who in child and adolescent psychiatry, publishing an article basically in
are 10 years old, 15 years old. And two, they're mainly in the psychiatry field, mental health, things like that, right? I mean, antidepressants are one example. Whoa, I'll forget it. Who needs that? You can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay. Oh, all right. It does make a terrible racket. Now, there's reasons for that. One is that psychopharmacology itself is a pretty weak science. This is not a field in which you have excellent biochemical markers for what makes a person depressed or schizophrenic or what have you. So developing any therapy in that space always is going to be about as bad of science as you get in the pharmaceutical field. Second of all, what's changed, thankfully, is not just the European transparency initiatives you mentioned, but also the medical journals decided that they would not publish clinical trials unless the trials were registered. And that was a non-legal solution by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which I think was very useful. And I was at the time on the editorial board of the CMAJ and also the Lancet, and we were amazed to see how all of a sudden certain trials that you'd get submitted stopped being submitted because it was just clear that the authors couldn't register and defend the trial publicly. So that really made a big difference and was a non-legal solution. Clinicaltrials.gov, websites that set up information on ongoing clinical trials has also helped that way. Now, one thing, Trudeau, that I want to mention is most of your research and your presentation has been on pre-market issues, clinical trials to get a product in the market. And I want to complement what you said by saying many of the same problems exist in a post-market context. So what does that mean? Once a drug is approved and on the market, regulation doesn't end. The regulator wants to inspect the factories and make sure that the factories live up to good manufacturing practice. The regulator wants to do what's called pharmacovigilance and make sure that the product, once on the market, once being taken by patients, does what it's supposed to do and is safe. And that's a different kind of regulatory science, post-market rather than pre-market. And I would say, if anything right now, the post-market space is more problematic than the pre-market because there's been so much progress, as you point out, made in the pre-market area. Let me tell you about some post-market nightmare stories. So one good example is what's happened with the offshoring of clinical trials. We are now finding that a lot of those were fraudulent. There's the case of GVK Pharma. This is an Indian company. A lot of clinical trials have moved to India. It's cheaper. GVK Pharma was recently busted by the European regulator for having faked the data on electrocardiograms used to get medicines onto the market. They just faked the data. Now, these are the tests that demonstrate whether a medicine will damage your heart or not. So this is not slightly important. As a result, the Europeans withdrew 700 medicines from their market like that earlier this year because this Indian company faked the data for all sorts of products. Now, what has Canada done? Nothing. What has the US done? Nothing. All those medicines are on the North American market. And you can imagine that something more needs to be done, although we don't really know what, because we don't have any way, lack of transparency, of knowing which medicines on the Canadian market are affected by GVK's fraudulent results. The names of the medicines are redacted. But without much doubt, there are markets in North America selling medicines that the Europeans have banned, and we probably would ban if we knew what they were. Another point to be made is in the post-market space, prosecution has been helpful where it's been done well. A very good colleague of mine, Dr. Dinesh Thakur, wonderful man, used to be a vice president at an Indian company called Ranbaxy, a generics company. He discovered while he was a senior executive there that Ranbaxy had faked stability data on its products. He blew the whistle on this using the US whistleblower law. Pity Canada doesn't have such a good law that way. But the end of that story was Ranbaxy pleaded guilty to defrauding the U.S. government and selling adulterated medicines in the U.S. market, paid $500 million, $500 million in civil and criminal penalties. And Dinesh, as the whistleblower, got a share of that. He walked out with about $40 million. So now he's a well-funded guy who loves causing trouble for pharma companies. We would like to see something, I think, like that in Canada. But our prosecution authorities are, let's just be honest, lame compared to the U.S. in that regard. And by the way, this offshoring thing and data manipulation thing is a current issue with even Canadian companies. In the last year or so, Apotex, a Canadian generics company, has been reproached by the United States, by the Food and Drug Administration, for not maintaining, quote, good manufacturing practices in certain Indian facilities. Because of that, our Minister of Health here, until recently, Rona Ambrose, imposed an import ban on Apotex's products from those factories, with the exception of only a few. Apotex sued the minister in a terrible, wrong federal court decision about a week ago. Apotex won and got the court to order that the import ban be lifted and the minister retract her comments. Just to show you how aggressive these companies can be, I was asked by the Toronto Star what I thought about that court decision, and I said, well, I think the court got it wrong. And I think, when the FDA has said that there are good manufacturing practice issues with Apotex, that's an issue. Within 2 hours, I got a letter from Apotex's lawyers asking me to withdraw that because it was defamatory. I'll be talking about that at the National Health Law Conference next month, the Apotex libel chill. You remember Dr. Nancy Oliveri? I guess my middle name's Oliveri or something. I don't know. But they're going down that road again. And that just shows you how aggressive these companies can be. But my point being, all of these examples are in the post-market space, mainly generics companies now, because the situation with the brand name companies and pre-market, so much has changed in the last 10 years that it's improving, and now it's the post-market space that's really more troublesome, I think. The last point on freedom of information, access to information, you couldn't be more right. The system sucks. I mean, in almost every country. One thing that, in our research, we filed hundreds of freedom of information, access to information requests in Canada, the US, and lately India. And I'm finding of the three countries, the fastest to respond to those requests is India. And the slowest is Canada. Our access to information system is worse than a third world country. I mean, I have access to information requests that are years old that have not been answered on drug and pharmaceutical issues. But in India, I get them answered often within weeks. And now the way that the Health Canada has manipulated Vanessa's law around Nav-Persaud's disclosures with diclectin, to me, I don't see a choice. I think that has to be judicially reviewed, because the idea that you would have Parliament passing a law saying Health Canada may disclose information, and then Health Canada only discloses it if you sign a confidentiality agreement. Confidential disclosure is not disclosure. That is not what Parliament meant. And that just needs to go to judicial review. Time to sue the tired old minister again, I guess. Anyway, the point being, these are really serious issues. I compliment everything you've done on it. I would say the post-market space deserves the Trudeau-Lemons treatment now, because that's under-researched.
In the remaining 15 minutes, I'd like to invite questions, comments from the audience. Yeah. And speak up, because it's a little bit harder to this way.
Okay, I'll continue, Professor Rattler.
Wait just 1 second.
Pharmacovigilance. Microphone is always better. So first of all, thank you, Professor Lemons, for a wonderful analysis of the way the industry manipulates and skews the information. And while I agree with you with everything you said about the way the have good legal solutions in our toolkit, and just because, as you suggested yourself, I think we have a problem, and Professor Adran suggested himself too, that we have a problem of industry capture, maybe some would say legislator capture, and the industry is extremely strong. So I'm usually not a proponent for technological fixes. I'm very critical of them, but I think we might have one solution in our toolkit that is just emerging now, which is the employment of biosensors. And before Ian Kerr and Michael Gus jump at me, I would say that these biosensors have to be strictly, completely not having wireless connectivity for privacy reasons. But I think that biosensors can unleash tons of new information that we haven't seen that is vital to assess the information in the post-clinical context. And what I would also suggest possibly that if the system works, and of course we need laws to govern these biosensor distribution, the privacy aspect, lack of connectivity, and so forth. But if we go with such a solution of unleashing the post-clinical information through biosensors, I think that this could also provide deterrence even in the clinical, even with clinical information, because if we have a good post-marketing pharmacovigilance system, then eventually companies would have less incentive to develop new pharmaceuticals that they know about their risk profile. So I would like your opinion about this idea.
Yeah, so I agree. Actually, it connects a little bit with the comments Amir made about the importance of post-market surveillance and pharmacovigilance. So I didn't talk about it because I actually wanted to particularly make the claim that the traditional emphasis on market entry data has kind of skewed the way we think about clinical trials evidence. So I didn't discuss, which I've discussed actually in other publications, yes, how post-market surveillance has improved, but it needs further improvement. It certainly will do a lot, but you have to keep in mind that there's actually also a lot of pressure on the system, particularly in the context of new drug development related to niche market drugs, orphan drugs, pharmacogenomic drugs, and so on, to actually allow pharmaceutical products to enter the market more quickly. Pressures that, or arguments that are being invoked there are that these often deal with life-threatening diseases, so we need access to these drugs faster. Also that it's harder to conduct large clinical trials because we're dealing with small markets. And so you get these drugs on the market before you actually gather the necessary pharmacovigilance data. It takes time. So you say the more we develop that system, the less likely pharmaceutical companies will have incentives to get the drugs out there. The profits generated by 1 year of sales of blockbuster or even now niche buster drugs can go up to $7-8 billion. And so even if there are hints or presumptions that there may be some problems with drugs, if you get a drug on the market for one particular year, even if pharmacovigilance starts showing at one point that there are problems with the drug, the profits will have been made. So the incentive of pharmacovigilance to be more careful about what drugs get on the market, I think, doesn't necessarily work. Another issue I would also say, the move towards getting drugs on the market faster with increased pharmacovigilance also creates difficulties from a public policy perspective, because once drugs are on the market, even if there are significant side effects, drug regulators get a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism when they decide to pull a drug from the market. And there I would want to give the example of Vioxx, for example, also to show you that it's not just for psychiatric drugs. I did select psychiatric drugs here in my examples, but I actually had a lot of others that I deleted that I couldn't discuss. Vioxx is one of them. So this was not psychiatric drugs. It was entered into the market. There are allegations that the company actually knew or should have known about some of the safety issues. The drug was on the market. It led to 10,000 or more premature deaths or heart attacks and strokes. So drugs are on the market. Even when Vioxx was pulled from the market, some people were saying, I really need this drug. So you drug regulators are taking away from me a drug that really helped me. So I don't know whether that claim is accurate or not, or whether that's appropriate or not. But once a drug is on the market, people resist the idea that what they think is really helping them and saving them will be pulled from the market. So it's not an easy decision to just say, oh, we'll have more pharmacovigilance and then gather information, pull the drug from the market. There are all kinds of incentives that leads often to keeping drugs on the market that are actually not necessarily safe.
Second and last question.
Jeremy DeVere, University of Ottawa. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like your comments on the relationship between these issues and the emergence of proprietary rights in respect of this data. Starting with the TRIPS agreement and recently expanded significantly through the Canada-EU CETA Trans-Pacific Partnership, and how these issues have emerged from really a health and safety issue to one of economic and commercial significance, and the issue of intellectual property rights in these data.
Yeah, so I couldn't discuss this in detail, but I don't have this is one thing I'm currently analyzing, working on, which is actually looking at the way in which the new transatlantic partnership agreement may impact on clinical trials data sharing. It's actually unclear. What is clear, though, obviously we don't have information yet about the details of the agreement, which is quite troubling. But when you look at some of the documents which I received from colleagues who have been working on this as well, and actually civil society organizations who are looking at this, so they obtained, through access to information legislation in the United States, documents that were submitted in the context of the trade negotiations. And you see there that industry was very hard pushing to have a very wide recognition of commercial secrecy. And so here you have a statement made to the chief negotiator for the United States. Pharma submitted to Douglas Bell, chair of the Trade Policy Staff Committee in 2013, a document where they say, we're really worried about these disclosure policies in Europe. So you, in your trade negotiations, you have to emphasize that this impacts on our trade interests and hinders innovation, which is always the easy argument to be made. And so, will that have an impact on what EMA, the European Medicines Agency, is doing? It's not clear. In the presentation, so I had some slides which I couldn't get into discuss in detail. I've actually looked at some some of the cases that went to the European Court of Justice, where you see that the European Court of Justice sided actually with the concept of transparency, but where the European Medicines Agency, after winning in court, basically caved into industry demands for secrecy, which I think is extremely troubling. So here you have a European court and an interim decision that was not a full decision, embracing or certainly taking distance from this right to privacy claim of industry, saying, "Whoa, wait a minute, this is not that obvious." So basically allowing the European Medicines Agency to disclose data, but you see the agency completely caving in and basically limiting data access, which I think could be related to this, that there is international pressure, that there is pressure from the European Union by the European Trade Commission to limit data access because of these concerns. So I think it's a problem that we have to fight, and that's also why I think a human rights discourse may help to make the claim basically that this is so essential that we have to create a space for transparency.
On that note, we're out of town. Before I thank the speaker, two quick announcements. First, for what it's worth, I wanted to apologize again for the tech difficulties and also mention that we did review the literature on the efficacy of the AV system in the room. So anyway, it's not just the pharma industry that has those problems. And I also wanted to mention that for any of you who is a first year in the room, the Center for Law, Technology and Society runs the Technoship program. The Center for Health Law, Policy and Ethics runs the Santiship program, which is a wonderful way for you to get involved in the cutting edge research that is going on both in the health law and the law and technology fields. And without further ado, on behalf of both centers, I would like to sincerely thank you, Professor Lemons, for speaking to us about this really interesting
time I have to catch a plane. My plane's at 4 or 5. Okay, so I
Oh.
should